Good morning, everybody. Okay, so uh, in yesterday's lesson, we made a start on the social structure of Imperial Germany. And obviously, because it was a slightly shortened lesson, being a period 3, as I said, we just need to pick up where we finished at the end of the lesson and just take it through to where we would have got to if we'd had the full hour. So the slide you're looking at here is we talked through this in the last 5 minutes of the lesson, so I won't sort of like go through it all again. But by way of an introduction, we talked about the old order of society. Okay, the fact that for hundreds of years, German society had been very rigid. There had been little social mobility, and society had largely been a rural society. And the big change that we start to see, that in particular after 1871, and to a large extent triggered by the unification, was a move from a rural society to a more urbanised or industrialised society. Okay, and that had a significant impact on the German way of life. And we finished off by looking at that slide. So there in the middle is the old order of society. There. So my pen's not working. There we go. The old order. And that's the way society had been organised really for hundreds of years. Okay. Now, at the top were the old elites. Remember, the elites are the sort of the social group, usually a small social group, who hold most political and economic power. And in the case of Prussia, which was the largest of the German states, they were called Junkers. But really, in whichever state you're talking about, whether it is Bavaria or Baden or Württemberg or Saxony, the elites were nobility, a social class that we often call the upper class, okay, like our Queen in England, whose power was based on inheritance. It was based on title, and the sign of a Prussian Junker was they would have the word von in their name, and usually pre-1870, these old elites, as we call them, whose power had existed for hundreds of years, were their main job were landowners. They owned extensive farms. Okay, and that was certainly the case with the Prussian Junkers. A man like Otto von Bismarck, although he was the Prime Minister of Prussia and then he became the Chancellor of Germany, his kind of daytime job, I suppose, would be he would be the owner of a vast farm. Okay, and working on his farm would be hundreds of people, and within his farm there would be villagers. Okay, and if there was a middle class and in those days, we tend to talk about small businesses based in the villages, and usually they were craft workers. Okay, so and we call these that type of middle class artisans. So they're represented in the middle there. But of course, the largest group socially were those who toiled and worked on the fields, very uneducated. And I mentioned in the lesson yesterday that being uneducated, they were often deeply religious, and the church was a sort of key, in those days, a key factor in their lives. And they would go to church on Sundays, they would listen to the priest, and the priest was usually an agent of what we call conservatism, preaching that it was ungodly to think about being in a different social class. Okay, you accepted what God had given to you. Okay, that's the old order. Now, to a large extent, what I've just described to you there was not just about the way it was in Germany, it was true in most European countries at this time. That's the way it had been for hundreds of years. Okay, little change. Okay, the one exception to that, certainly in Europe, was Britain. And Britain, I suppose, was a little bit ahead of the curve. They were the first country to have had an industrial revolution, and so society in Britain was becoming industrialised, and that has an impact on the way society, on the social classes in Britain. And to an extent, what happened in Britain started to happen in Germany after about 1870. It was difficult for Germany to industrialise before 1870 because Germany didn't exist, and I pointed that out in the lesson. Because Germany consisted of 38 smaller states, the opportunities for industrialisation were not so enhanced. But once Germany was united into a single country in 1871, and therefore internal barriers disappeared, there were increased opportunities for trade within Germany, and that, in a sense, triggered a rapid industrial expansion after 1871. So after 1871, we talk about this emerging order, a rapid shift to an urban economy, and that is what we call social mobility. And the first feature of social mobility was what we call a Landflucht, a movement from the countryside to the towns. It didn't happen overnight. It happened over decades, but gradually, more and more people came to live in growing industrial towns. Because the key feature of the Industrial Revolution is they discovered new ways of manufacturing things. Okay, and in the old order, things were made in cottages in the countryside. But now they've managed to harness new forms of power, steam power, based on coal fields, for example, and therefore power was based on factories. And where factories were developed, there was immense power within factories. Towns grew around factories, and so people moved from the countryside into the towns. And that was a sort of key feature. It started in Britain in the 1820s and 30s. Other European countries like France followed suit, but Germany was fairly late because it was a new country to industrialise. Okay, and when you got these emerging order, this shift to a new type of order, social order, what began to happen is that new social classes began to appear. So at the top of our social pyramid, you see a new type of elite based in the towns, and we call them the industrialists, rich people. And unlike the old elites, and the old elites are still there, they still hold much of the power. We'll look at that, that the potential conflict, new elites challenging the old elites for power, that sort of thing. But where new elites emerged, people like Rathenau, who formed a company that exists today, AEG. Okay, we've got washing machines and dishwashers. That's a company from the Second Reich. Bosch, another company, etc., etc. So many of these sort of great German manufacturing concerns that are still evident in our kitchens today, they were industrialists from the Second Reich. Okay, but of course the point is that their power was not based on inheritance. It was not based on birth. It was not based on. They were not nobility. They were self-made men, and they were often born in a lower class, okay, in a class below them. Some of them were born as poor, lowly people in the countryside. They moved to the cities. They taught themselves. How to read and write, and they climbed the social ladder. But they grabbed that opportunity that resulted from industrialisation. Okay, so that's the new elites. And where factories grew and where towns grew, inevitably there were all what we sometimes called ancillary type occupations. So factory owners, for example, needed scientists to research new ways of production, and they needed money, so banking developed. They needed administrators for their concerns for whatever they were producing, and so they needed schools to educate people to be able to read and write and to manage the systems of factories. And so out of industrialisation grew a new middle class, an educated professional middle class. And these are what we call the white collar workers. Okay, so very different from the middle classes in the countryside, who were small businesses like blacksmiths and maybe wheel makers. There's probably a word for wheel makers. Is it a wheelwright? I'm not sure. But the artisans were the sort of skilled people in the villages. Okay, but their skill and their trade was based on the countryside, whereas in the cities, these growing towns and cities, you've got a middle class whose wealth and status is based on a very specific skill set, which is to do with industrialisation. And then, in the same way as you've got peasants in the countryside with the old order, you've got industrial workers. Now, we'll do a whole lesson on who the industrial workers were, but the industrial workers were they were largely peasants who had moved to the towns. But now they're not toiling in the fields, they're toiling in the factories. And they were the largest single group in the towns. Okay, and like the peasants, they had very little power. Okay, so we'll be doing a whole series of lessons developing these social groups and developing an understanding of these social groups over time. Okay, this is just an introduction. I'm giving you the big picture. So I think we've covered these points. The old order was a class society there, a conservative mentality. In particular, the old elites, we call them the conservatives because they really didn't want society to change in some ways. They felt quite threatened by the emerging order because there's a new elite who's emerging as being important. And that's, in a sense, a threat to the power of the old elites. And certainly the old order don't really want society to change, in the sense that they want to keep the peasants at the bottom. They don't want peasants to rise up the ladder and to challenge their power. So that's what we mean when we talk about the conservatives. Okay, so social ambition was condemned, often by the church. But the problem is society was rapidly transforming, and that was unavoidable, and that inevitably had a profound social impact. And in particular, these groups, the old elites, people like Otto von Bismarck, had to look at what the way society was transforming and decide, how do we manage that, okay, without losing our power? How do we harness the energy of industrialisation, allow it to happen? Because that's good. Industrialisation will make Germany stronger, for example. The factories will make the weapons that will provide the army to defend this country that we now rule, the elites. But how do we ensure that happens without us losing our power? Because there was an extreme concern that the new elites could end up being the people who really run the new Germany. So we'll develop these themes as we go through. Okay. So that was a little bit of a lengthy introduction for what we covered yesterday. I think that was useful. It was a little bit rushed towards the end of the lesson yesterday. So what I've shown here is a sort of social pyramid, and I've used colours to sort of represent the blue are the old classes that have been around for a long time. So you've got the upper class, okay, who are there. The landed, and we often call them the aristocracy. In Prussia, they were called Junkers, also known as conservative elites. We've covered that. And then you've got, in the countryside, the artisans. Okay, and the German word for artisan, which I want you to use, is Mittelstand. Okay, craft workers, small tradespeople in the countryside. But what we've got as a result of industrialisation is you've got three new social classes appearing at the bottom, middle, and top of the social pyramid. So at the bottom of the social pyramid, you've now got a new type of lower class, the labouring classes or the working classes, the urban classes, as opposed to the rural working classes who we call peasants. And in the middle of the social pyramid, you've got a new type of middle class who we call the white collar workers, again, or the German word, we can call them the Beamter. And it's always good to use the German word, so build that into your vocabulary. And then at the top of the social pyramid, you've got the new elites whose power and position is based on their own hard work. It's not to do with birth. And they are there, okay, the industrial new elites. And to a large extent, there's potentially a little bit of a power struggle between those two elites, okay, because historically the landed nobility hold the political power. They run their countries, which until 1871 were 38 small countries. They hold the political power. And after 1871, the elites still hold the political power because the Prussian Junkers are in charge of the running of Germany. They hold the political power in Germany. The new elites, the industrial elites, tend to have the economic power, okay? And they didn't really have much political power, and we'll look at that, okay? But they certainly held economic influence because they control the new factories and the industry that Germany needs to be able to prosper in this new industrial age. Okay, so there's our introduction. Hopefully you've now grasped those key terms. Remember those key historical terms, bottom right there. You should be building up a glossary, okay, so that you're developing your language as we go through. Okay, so we'll finish off the lesson by just looking at the so-called aristocracy. Now, the aristocracy is another word for the upper classes or the conservative elites. Okay, so in a nutshell, so we've kind of covered this. The aristocracy were also known as the upper classes. Okay, or they might be called the nobility, or they might be called the conservative elites. Okay, and they were the traditional groups from the old order that held the power, those with titles, okay, kings, queens, dukes, princes, grand dukes, etc., okay, whose power was based on birth, who also tended to be large landowners, okay, and they ruled their German state, often with autocratic power, okay, and we talked about this in the previous lesson. There were a series of protest movements, which we call the 1848 revolutions, and pretty much by the 1870s, most of the upper classes had conceded we need to give a little bit of influence to the middle classes through elected parliaments. Okay, so in Prussia, which is the largest of the German states, and of course which is important because Prussia came to control the new Germany, the upper classes were called Junkers, okay, just in a sense the Prussian word for nobility. And the most powerful of all the Junkers was the King of Prussia. And of course the King of Prussia became the Emperor of Germany. And the first Emperor of Germany was King Wilhelm I of Prussia, who therefore became Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. Okay, and the Junkers, as we said, tended to hold on to the political power. They controlled government, and they controlled most of the positions at the top level of government. Okay, the machinery of government. So in Prussia, the civil service was the machinery of government. It was the administrative apparatus to run a country, and that would include, for example, schools. Okay, but the foreign ministry and etc. The revenue organisations to collect taxation, etc. That's the civil service, and the Junkers tended to control those organisations. You couldn't really get the top jobs in the Prussian civil service, unless you were of that particular family. Okay, so their status sort of like expanded to include sort of the administration of government. And that also included education, so universities, the deans of faculties and professors tended to be junkers, and the judiciary, the legal system, the judges, the courts tended to be controlled by the upper classes. Okay, but the one organisation that we will talk about more than anything else, and we have already mentioned it, was the Prussian army. Okay, now we know how important the Prussian army was. It created Germany. It fought a war against Denmark in 1862, and then it fought a war against Austria in 1866, and of course, then it fought a war against France in 1870 to 71. And in each of those wars, Prussia won that war, but the smaller German states sort of rallied behind Prussia for protection, sort of almost hiding behind Prussia, frightened of the Danes and the Austrians and the French, and of course that created Germany. And so the new Germany, and again we'll do a whole lesson on it, was in a sense dominated by Prussia, and a strong awareness that the Prussian army had created Germany. And in the same way as the Prussian Junkers held on to the key instruments of political power, the King of Prussia was the Emperor of Germany, etc., and they controlled the civil service and the universities and the judicial system. The top level of the Prussian army, what we call the officer class, were absolutely controlled by the Junkers, the Prussian Junkers. And to access all those positions, you needed to be born into a Junker family. Okay, so that's the aristocracy in a nut. Slides just basically expand a little bit on that. So let's just quickly go through the points. So politically, they were the most powerful group. If you look at the map of Germany, okay, and we'll do a lot more about this. The huge flat land, which is best for farming, and the richest land, okay, in terms of farming, and you can see the rivers running through it, the Elbe, the Oder, the Vistula, were in the east, okay, the east. And much of Prussia was in the eastern part of Germany, okay. So when we talk about the Prussian aristocracy and their big farms that they controlled, it was when Germany was united in 1871, because Prussia was mainly in the east of Germany, not completely, it extended to the west as well, but most of the most powerful Prussian Junkers were based in the east. And in fact, Berlin itself lay more towards the east of Germany. Okay, so we talked about hereditary privileges, just picking up the sort of key vocabulary. Their social superiority was built up over many, many generations and hundreds of years. And they were the upper class, the Kingdom of Prussia. And of course, in 1871, when Germany came into existence, that Prussian dominance extended to the new German Empire. We've covered that, okay? And most of these aristocrats, the nobility, the Junkers, had titles, the word von, and they were farmers, owning huge farms, mainly to the east of the River Elbe, the map that we looked at there, in Prussia, okay? And they were privileges, okay? They had rights and opportunities that other Germans from the lower classes did not have. So they had access to the top positions in the army, the officer corps, okay? And of course the Prussian army is now the Imperial army, okay? You see the word Imperial, it means of the empire as opposed to of the separate state. And also in the Imperial civil service, and also the judiciary, and also universities education, okay? And that sort of sense of dominance, particularly in the Prussian army, even went so far as to many Junkers opposed the expansion of the German army. We'll do a whole lesson on the German army at some point, but it was renowned around the world as being the most effective and the most effective and successful German army in warfare. Okay, and its effectiveness did not come out of its size. It was actually quite a small, tightly closed army. dominated and controlled by the Prussian elites. And of course, what was happening in the late 19th century is armies were getting bigger. Okay, um, the lower classes were being given positions as soldiers in these new armies, and the Prussian elites, in a sense, were a little bit worried about that. They thought that if we let too many commoners into the lower ranks of the army, the soldiers, it will dilute our influence. Okay, and it will change the nature of this great German army, which is very much dominated by the upper classes. So that, again, that's something that we'll look at. Okay, but there was apprehension about that, and they were very, very proud of their status and political privileges, which they saw as a right not to be let, I should say, not to be let go of, not hold of. Okay, and the most senior Prussian Junker was, of course, the King of Prussia, who became the Kaiser of Germany. Okay, and all members of his imperial government were drawn from this class. And the imperial government was the new government that was set up after Germany was created in 1871. So imperial always means of the empire. Okay, and it was largely the same people who were also in his government in Prussia. They simply took on additional jobs, like Bismarck, who was the head of the Prussian government, became the head of the imperial government. Okay, so that's that. But the aristocracy were under threat economically and politically. Now, those two key words are really important, and we'll constantly use them. And as you do, when you, as good A-level students, you often will use those words, economically and politically, as sort of pegs to hang your ideas and as headings to structure your essays around. Okay, to order your ideas. So economically is to do with money and wealth. Okay, now clearly the landed nobility, and I've done a little shot there of the top of our pyramid. Okay, we've now got a new elite, the industrial elites. Okay, and of course the point is society was changing, and the economic power of the aristocracy was based on the countryside. For hundreds of years they were big farmers, and the wealth of any country was based on agriculture. But of course what's happening is, after 1871, Germany is industrialising, and with industrialisation people are starting to realise that there are new opportunities for wealth that are based in these new growing towns and cities. In other words, industrialisation is causing a flight from the land, something we call the Landflucht. Peasants are moving from the countryside into the cities. Now, at first, that was just seasonal. Okay, every summer they would go back into the countryside for the harvest, and then in the autumn and winter they would move back into the cities to work in the factories. And of course, not everybody moved. Many people stayed in the countryside. But relatively speaking, what this meant is agriculture was struggling a little bit, okay? And that the wealth of the new Germany tended to be more created out of the growing industrial towns and cities, okay? And so that basically meant these groups, the industrial elites, were therefore emerging as a new economic power. They tended to have a lot of wealth, okay? So economically, the Junkers, just because you were at the top of the social pyramid and had the title, didn't necessarily mean you were very rich. Many Junkers were falling on hard times. Their farms were feeling the pinch. They were losing workers to the cities, okay? So everybody may look up to them, and they may have the top jobs in the army, etc., and in the government, but in terms of their own personal wealth, some of them were starting to struggle. Okay. Politically, though, the Junkers continued to hold on to power. Okay, and of course, in 1871, and we'll do a whole lesson about this. One of the key features of the new Germany is it was agreed we need to give the vote, expand the vote to more people lower down in the social pyramid. And of course, when people vote to be represented in government, a parliament is formed. Okay, a representative assembly that represents everybody in the social pyramid, not just the people at the top. And the word we use for parliament for the new Germany that was the German Empire that was created in 1871 was the Reichstag. Okay, now the Parliament of Prussia was called the Landtag, and do you remember we talked about that? The old Prussian Parliament, it was a heavily biased voting system. The upper classes, the Prussian Junkers, their vote counted for 3 men. The middle classes, their vote counted for 2 men. The lower classes, their vote counted for 1 man. Whereas in the new Imperial Parliament, formed in 1871, the Reichstag, it was 1 man, 1 vote. And we'll do a whole lesson about the Reichstag. Okay, so inside the Reichstag, there were political parties that represented each of the different social groups. Okay, so when there were elections, a bit like today, okay, people vote for political parties, and then the members of parliament belong to political parties, and we've got Conservative and Labour and Liberal Democrats and so on. Okay, well, the political party that represented the old aristocracy, the old elites, were not by coincidence called the Conservative Party, but Conservative with a large C, and so that's who represented them in the Reichstag. But we'll do a whole lesson about the political parties that represented the social groups, and the point is the aristocracy were losing their traditional majority every time there were elections. The other political parties that represented the different groups below them, starting with the industrial new elites and moving down to the white-collar workers and the urban workers, they were tending to get more and more votes. Okay, and that was an issue. That was a challenge to the aristocracy. Okay, so that's the first challenge. They were also challenged by the new federalised Germany. Okay, because previously, if you were a Prussian Junker, you were the lord. You dominated Prussia. Okay, but now Prussia is actually just part of a new Germany, which consists of these separate German states, 25 of them. And we did that last lesson. Remember, in theory, when Germany came into existence, all the states were equal. Prussia was no more powerful in theory than any of the other states. It was an equal partnership. The King of Prussia and the King of Bavaria and the Duke of Baden, the Duke of Saxony, etc., formed a partnership, and they elected that the King of Prussia should be the emperor. Okay, but it was an equal partnership. So, in a sense, the Prussian Junkers were therefore being challenged by the other states who were now admitted into that equal partnership in the German Empire. It meant that the Junkers didn't really have as much influence as they used to, that the distant regions of the empire were not directly controlled by the Junkers. So that was an additional threat to their power. Their power, in a sense, was diluted by the power of the other states. So the Prussian Junkers, how did they respond to this threat? Okay, well, they responded in several ways. The first way, within the Reichstag, the elected parliament of the German Empire, where, remember, it was 1 man, 1 vote, okay, unlike in Prussia, where the vote was weighted, they formed an alliance with the political party that represented the industrial new elites. Okay, and the political party that in the Reichstag that represented the industrial new elites were called the National Liberals. So you've got the Conservative Party, that was the political party of the upper classes in the new empire, and you've got the National Liberals, which was the political party of the industrial new elites. Okay, and what we've actually got there is a sense by these new elites, but in many ways we need to work together and help each other out. Okay. Yes, you could argue that the new elites will want to take power from the old elites, but what they both recognised is beneath us, we have got these growing lower classes, okay, who are more mobile, who are hungry for influence themselves. And then to a large extent, if the elites work together, the Conservative Party and the National Liberals, in other words, the old upper classes and the new upper classes, in a sense, the new elites, then it's in our interest to work together. Okay, so the big farmers, the old elites, and the new industrialists in Germany kind of formed a partnership to you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. We'll work together. Okay, and that's a sort of key feature of how the Prussian Junkers responded to that threat. So by doing this, they hoped that they would be able to maintain their dominance. Okay, by giving the upper classes, the new elites, okay, at the top level of the middle classes, an incentive to work with them. Okay, and that basically meant that the old elites had to compromise with these new big businessmen, the industrial elites, and give them a degree of influence in the running of the new Germany. Okay, so what that basically meant is the policy of the Prussian Junkers was to give the industrial elites some say in the running of the new Germany. Okay, with recognition that that was necessary. After all, these new industrial elites, they did make the weapons, for example, that the great German army, which was run by the old elites, needed to win battles and to win wars. Okay, so that's the sort of idea there. So there was a threat to the aristocracy. They responded by forming an alliance with the industrial. Okay, so there's a little extract from Abrams, page 21, which is, of course, is part of your follow-up to this double lesson about social class. And I've just done a screenshot of the relevant paragraph, okay, from Abrams. So I'm not going to talk you through that. There are new words there like feudal, bourgeoisie, okay, and agrarian, all in there, bourgeoisie. Proletariat is another new word. There's that word feudal in the middle. Okay, there's that word agrarian. Part of being a good A-level student, of course, is working independently. Okay, yeah, it's my job to teach, but it would be wrong of me to feed you everything. Okay, a good independent student has got to work independently. So when you're doing the reading from Abrams, have a dictionary to hand, look up new words, figure out what it means, add them to the glossary. Don't wait for me to do it for you. You've got to work independently as an A-level student, because remember, A-level is a bridge towards university study. A-level is much closer to university study than it is to GCSE, and certainly at university the expectation is that you will absolutely work independently. That you will always have a thirst and hunger to look at new words. So read that, look at the new words, make sense of it, okay, and hopefully it will make sense to you after that. If you still get stuck, if you still don't understand, obviously message me in chat. Finish the lesson. There's a knowledge retrieval which we'll use at the start of tomorrow's lesson, so maybe you can have a quick look up the answers. I'm giving you a sneak preview of that. Didn't intend that to happen, but there you go. I'll stop there. See you in the lesson tomorrow. Thank you.